Despite competitive market conditions, macroeconomic trends, and severe weather trends that have impacted the U.S. property casualty segment's underwriting results for a decade, insurers have still managed to improve their underwriting and operating results, according to a new AM Best report. We're joined today by Senior Industry Analyst Christopher Graham and Associate Analyst Alex Wynett, both of whom were involved in taking a deeper look at underwriting expense trends. Chris and Alex, welcome. So great to see you both. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lori. Thanks for having us today.
Chris, can you briefly set the stage here in terms of the overarching conditions and factors that P&C underwriters have faced over the past decade?
So, underwriting expenses have actually dropped over the past decade, most of that coming within the last 5 years. Some of that we can attribute to a shift in your remote workplace. Obviously, when employees are working at home, companies don't need as much office space and therefore rent. So that's one place they can cut it. Another place that's been really prominent is not so much that they've cut expenses by dollar amount, but they've had rate increases, especially in the personal lines the last couple of years, that have been double digits. So when you get a double digit rate increase and you have a somewhat fixed expense on things like, especially on things like leases for your property, that's an area where it's like, that's going to bring your ratio down simply because you have, a larger base on which to compare it. So those are two of the biggest factors, and it somewhat stems from rent as well. Commission and brokerages have been relatively consistent. Usually, like, agents get a certain share of the premium, so that's not going to change. So you look for other areas, and that's the big one.
So what did your analysis of underwriting performance show?
Well, we've said the overall underwriting expenses have dropped over the past 5 years. That's about 2.5 points lower than where they were in 2019 versus end of the year 2024. Well, the combined ratio for 2024 was about 96.5. So now you've cut your expenses by 2.5 points. So you can almost, you can somewhat look at it that way and say, 2.5 points in underwriting expenses out of 3.5 points as being your margin. You've got pushing 70% of your profit coming from the cut in underwriting expenses. So it's been a big part of what's made insurance profitable, the last year.
Alex, were there specific areas where P&C companies were able to minimize expenses?
Yep. Of the 4 expense components that contribute to the underwriting expense ratio, the category other acquisition expense and general expense came down. Other acquisition expense mainly refers to the cost of writing new business. From 2021 to 2023, you had heavy underwriting losses, and therefore contingent commissions as a percentage of total acquisition costs came way down. And then, as Chris was saying earlier, rent came down, and rent payments are also kind of unintuitively part of this other acquisition expense category. So COVID caused a mass exodus from commercial workspace, and now you have insurers paying way less in rent than they did before. And that made the bulk of this 2.5% decrease that we saw in the underwriting expense ratio. A lot of it came from lessened rent payments. And then in the general expense bucket, that has a lot to do with like fixed operating costs and overhead, and underwriting salaries are a part of that. And we've talked about automation and digitalization for a long time, but now it's really starting to kick in. A lot of underwriting departments are being thinned out, and what's left are these underwriting stewards who look over these AI co-pilots, or they look at these internally generated underwriting softwares that are trained on decades of data. So Basically, the story here is that you have automation is kicking in, rent payments are less, and contingent commissions are less of a cost because you had a few years of really poor underwriting.
Advertising spend has always been a key category in this segment. Alex, what did the analysis determine in that regard?
Yeah, right off the bat, we saw that the largest PC line, personal auto, had the largest budget, and that was unsurprising. That made sense. We also saw that of this top 20 lists of advertisers in terms of spend, for those advertising dollars, we saw that the top 5 accounted for 75% of those advertising dollars, and the top 10 accounted for 85% of those advertising dollars. So yes, there's a lot of advertising and insurance, but it's really concentrated at the top. The next takeaway was that it's a very fundamental takeaway, but it's that insurance is cyclical, and you have headwinds and tailwinds, and you have trends that flip-flop decade over decade. And in terms of advertising spend, when a business line performs well, you see lots of insurers flock to that market segment and increase spend. And then the opposite is true. When a business line performs poorly, they pull back. So one way to exhibit this is we can just look at the last year and a half. In 2023, the industry had an underwriting loss of $33 billion. And then in 2024, they had a underwriting gain of $12 billion. And what happened? Well, on average, there was a 60% increase in advertising expenditure. Another important piece of context for this is that there's a lot of advertising, but these huge, crazy increases in advertising expenditure are really only true for these personal line monoliths. Progressive and Allstate both increased their advertising expenditure 187%. And on that top 20 list, there were some triple-digit increases, but none with the scale that Progressive and Allstate have. So yeah, to summarize everything, what you can take away from this paper is that advertising is a major expense for insurers, but it's a highly adjustable expense. And when return on equity is concerned, it's the easiest to change, and it's the first one to change always.
Alex and Chris, such a pleasure to speak with you both. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having us today, Lori.
Yep, thank you.
That was Senior Industry Analyst Christopher Graham and Associate Analyst Alex Wynett. You can find the full report online at ambest.com. For AM Best TV, I'm Lori Chortis.